services and resources that we can provide, as well as like our mission and all of that at the end of the presentation. So ransomware, of course, is one of the biggest cyber threats that we're seeing. This has been ramping up for several years at this point, but this is just a snapshot of maybe the most major ransomware incidents that have occurred over the last several years. We're seeing an evolution within ransomware, though. It just keeps evolving in order to get these monetary funds to these cyber criminals. That's most often going to be the motivation there. I would say 95%, 99% in some cases of the time, they're looking to get some sort of money out of their activities when it comes to ransomware. One of the reasons why we're seeing an even bigger explosion of ransomware in the last year or two than we did prior to that is because of something called ransomware as a service. So just like how you and I, we purchase pieces of software, Microsoft Office 365, for example, I get an account with them. So I provide money to them or through work, however we get that account. And that enables me to use that service. So I'm not creating the code to use Office 365. I'm purchasing it from somebody else who has created that code and has created that program. We're seeing the same thing with ransomware. So years prior, these cyber threat actors would have to actually create these programs to use to target different companies or individuals. And now these programs are just being sold. So the software ransomware is just being sold or rented. So individuals, criminals that are not very high tech can use these programs to launch these ransomware attacks. So it's not that we're seeing very super technical individuals engaged in this activity. We're seeing it across the board. So the barrier to entry with this activity has gotten lower and lower over the past several years. I'm going to compare the first quarter to the second quarter of this year. So this first slide is the first quarter of 2021. You can see some statistics there. The average ransom amount paid in the first quarter is around $220,000. It's a lot of money. And we'll go into why I'm saying it's quite a bit of money in the next couple of slides. The downtime is 23 days. That has steadily increased over the past couple of years as well, the average amount of downtime due to a ransomware incident. So that's not just all the files and everything on the system and network is encrypted, and now I've decrypted it. It's not just that time, it's the amount of time to get all of the systems back up and running and get to normal operations. The top attack vectors have been pretty consistent. Phishing is a top attack vector. So email-based threats that come in, and a user has to have some sort of engagement with that email in most cases to launch that ransomware payload onto the network. Rdp compromise is another top attack vector that we've seen consistently. RDP is remote desktop protocol. An example of how you would use RDP is, now that a lot of people are still working from home, and even more were this past year. If I need to access a network resource at my office, so my office's network, their intranet, I can use something like RDP to get into that network, even though I'm in a remote location. So establishing that connection allows me to get those services and that data, but it also creates this avenue, this new attack vector that malicious cyber threat actors can exploit to gain access to that company's network. Software vulnerabilities, that actually increased in the first quarter of this year. People are using those. So there was a couple of Microsoft Exchange server vulnerabilities that came out this past year. Something like that could be used, a threat actor could exploit that vulnerability to gain access to that network and then launch a ransomware payload onto the network. Ransomware costs in 2020 overall were about $20 billion. And from my understanding, that's only the amount paid for ransom. That doesn't include the cost of lost revenue from downtime and the cost of remediation services as well. In 77% of cases, there was a data exfiltration component. This is one of the more recent trends that we're seeing increase, is this data exfiltration. So what's occurring here is that when a cyber threat actor or cyber criminal gains access to a network, instead of launching the ransomware immediately, what they'll do is exfiltrate data off of that network first, launch the ransomware payload, and then tell that victim, okay, you might have data backups to restore your network from and don't have to pay the ransom to me. But if you don't pay the ransom, I'm going to post publicly all of that data that I stole off your network. And there are data exfiltration, the sites that these cyber threat actors use to post publicly that data. So then you get into a situation where these companies, these organizations have to figure out what data was stolen. For one, does it have intellectual property information? Does it have personally identifiable information, protected health information, other types of information that they could not only be publicly shamed for having this information out there, but they also get into a case where now it's a data breach, and then they also might get fined for publicly exposing that protected data. So we're seeing that increase because it's forcing the hand of these victims to still pay a ransom demand, even if they can restore by themselves. The top targets, healthcare and professional services. Healthcare is one of the major targets. Even during the pandemic, when cyber criminals claimed that they were going to lay off the healthcare sector due to all the constraints from COVID, we're still seeing them as a top target. They cannot afford to have downtime the way that some of the companies might be able to, and therefore they might be more likely to pay ransoms. So that's one of the reasons why they're a top targeted sector. Professional services include organizations, businesses like managed service providers, IT service providers. The reason that they are targeted is because they are one hub, and all of these cyber threat actors can gain access to several clients just by gaining access to that one managed service providers network. So they might be somebody, if you outsource your IT to a company, that would be something like a managed service provider, professional services that's targeted. And you'll see the comparison here from the first quarter. The ones that I highlighted in yellow were the changes between the first and the second quarter. The ransom amounts actually decreased from the first to the second quarter of this year. This is due in part by the fact that ransomware became an even bigger focus towards the, beginning of the second quarter of this year. With the Colonial Pipeline incident that occurred, there was a lot more publicity around ransomware and its effects. Heads of state, law enforcement, and CEOs, insurance companies are all focused now on ransomware more than they had been before. And you see even the president had put out an executive order after the Colonial Pipeline incident to shore up the cybersecurity efforts in critical infrastructure. So you see a lot more focus. That might mean that these cyber threat actors are targeting smaller organizations and therefore are demanding slightly less money in ransom. 81% of cases now included data exfiltration components. So it's up from that 77. And like I said before, we're just seeing an increase of that tactic. The top targets, healthcare actually fell off and the public sector came on as a top target. I wanted to highlight this too, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying with the $20 billion in losses last year. In May, a company, Scripps Health, was hit by ransomware. It took 4 weeks for them to recover, but these stats are significant. $21.1 million just in response and recovery costs, $91.5 million in lost revenue. Only less than $6 million of that was actually recovered from their insurance company. You can see here, we pay a lot of attention to the average ransom amounts and the ransom costs, but we fail to also include this context of, okay, you might be paying a couple $100,000 in a ransom demand, or you have to shore that up with how much millions of dollars in this case that you can lose to lost revenue from having that downtime. And that's very important here, is that if you pay a ransom, you can get back up and running much quicker than restoring from data backups, which is a problem. So that makes it more likely that these companies are going to just pay the ransom demand to get back up and running instead of using something like a data backup to restore their systems. You can see here just in that downtime really costs these businesses and organizations a lot of money. And it's something that we don't talk about enough, in my opinion. So you can see here, these are the common industries that are targeted. And you can see that healthcare, while it did fall off slightly from the first quarter, is still in the top 3 targeted sectors. And this one I want to highlight as well. because we hear about ransomware in the news a lot, it's going to be those more enterprise, very large organizations that are hit with these ransomware, because a lot of the time that it ends up affecting their constituents or their patrons. Like the Colonial Pipeline incident, for example, half the East Coast was impacted by that ransomware incident. So we hear about it a lot. But you can see here that 75% of attacks actually impact companies with less than 1,000 employees. So this is really large in part a small to medium-sized business and organization problem. And they don't have as many resources as an enterprise or very large corporation would to restore from these. So it makes it more likely that they would have to close their doors and close their business if they're hit with something like ransomware. So while I said, obviously it's going to take more time to restore from data backups, it's your best bet to fight against ransomware. And there are several other best practices that these businesses and organizations should follow to make them less likely to be impacted by ransomware. Making sure to encrypt any sensitive data that you have in your own network so that if it is exfiltrated by these cyber threat actors, they can't post it publicly because it's encrypted. And then having business continuity plans in place, exercising these COOP plans these COOPs to make sure that you know what each of your IT department, your C-suite, your public relations and people are going to be doing in the case of a ransomware incident, so that you can get back up and running quicker. And I highlighted the Colonial Pipeline incident here as because it will transition into the next section nicely. So I'm sure that we all heard about this incident. They were concerned that their pipeline operations, those systems that allow the gas to flow, would end up being impacted by this ransomware, and then their operational technology systems would not work. So they shut down everything. It was only for a couple of days, almost a week. They did pay the ransom. It was $4.4 million. I think they recovered some of that through their work with the FBI and I think maybe Secret Service as well. You can see here people kind of use like pandemonium a little bit. Well, the way that these cyber threat actors actually gained access to the Colonial Pipeline network was through a breached password from one of the employees. So Colonial Pipeline, it wasn't that they stole the password there. It was that one of their employees used the same password to access Colonial Pipeline's network that they do to access another account, and that account was breached. So this leads into this credential compromise conversation. We talk about credentials a lot, particularly now, and we talk about them in the fact that they're the keys to the kingdom. And the reason that we say that is because something like this, where there are millions of people that are impacted by a ransomware incident, it's caused by the fact that a credential was exposed. So there are ways to make sure that we're better protecting our credentials, our passwords. This is a website, haveibeenpwned.com. If you put your email address in there, this is an old email of mine, it will provide you information about public data breaches that have occurred and what information was exposed in those breaches. So if, it says here that LinkedIn, my password was exposed in a LinkedIn breach, excuse me. So if I didn't get an email from LinkedIn or a notification from LinkedIn that my password was breached, or I just didn't pay attention to it and didn't change my password, if you go to a platform like this, this service, then you'll know, okay, I definitely need to change my password for X, Y, and Z account. The best method to protect against credential compromise, so in the case of the Colonial Pipeline incident, if they had multi-factor authentication required for all of their employees, that cyber threat actor would not have gained access to the Colonial Pipeline network. Multi-factor authentication is a combination of at least 2 of 3 factors. Something you have, something you know, and something you are. Something you know is likely going to be a password of some sort. Something you have would be something like a code. A lot of the times it's sent via text message, but we do recommend authentication applications, authentication apps over the text messages. Or you can get, it looks like a little, it's a little smaller than a USB drive, but it's a hardware token. You can just put on your keychain, and you can use those codes instead too. Something you are would be something like a biometric, but it's your best bet to prevent account compromise if your password is exposed. And you see here, this is just the tree kind of showing that. So if I If my password is breached at LinkedIn, for example, if I'm using that same password for a more sensitive account, say Chase Online Banking, if that threat actor tries to use that password from LinkedIn on my Chase account, they'll get past the first authentication, but then they'll be prompted for that second factor. If I have multi-factor authentication enabled, they're not gonna be able to get into my account unless they have that code somehow. They have my device maybe, or they have my biometrics on my fingerprint. So you are much less likely to have your account compromised this way. Leading into social engineering, I'm not going to go too far into this because I think we're aware of a lot of these social engineering tactics. You can see some statistics here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see that it's millions, if not billions of dollars in losses from these different types of social engineering scams. But I'm going to highlight one that, you know, it's out there, we talk about it sometimes, but not necessarily with the same level of care that we should in some cases. So these tech support scams. You might have come in contact with one of these at some point. Either maybe you accidentally click on an ad on a web page and it redirects you to a site like this. It makes it seem like your device has a virus on it. You might get a pop-up on a screen. A lot of times they ask you to call a number and they pretend that they're from maybe Microsoft support, for example. They might ask you for remote access to your device so they can get everything that's on your device. Or they might ask you or recommend that you pay them a certain amount of money for an antivirus program to get your device clean. These are scams, obviously. Microsoft or Apple or whoever is not going to contact you directly about a virus on your device. That won't happen. But this was an interesting case. It's from earlier this year that it was reported to us. It was reported in January to us, but actually occurred in January or December rather. So this individual, they were on their computer, a screen came up, it looked like it was from Microsoft Corporate Security and that their computer was locked. In order to unlock it, they had to call the fraud prevention department. So they speak to this individual, and there was somebody from Microsoft and another person from Chase Bank who also reported to the FBI, but they developed a sense of urgency and secrecy with this individual, this woman who was in her 70s, early 70s. And explained to her that her device was compromised and that they were running an investigation trying to figure out what was happening and to make sure they wanted to make sure that her device would no longer be compromised. They wanted to protect her funds, and they requested that she move funds from her one account into another account while they conducted their investigation so that the supposed cyber criminal wouldn't be able to access her funds. They did this for several days, and said that in 30 days, then she would get her funds back. When that date occurred where she was supposed to get her funds again, she could no longer contact them. But prior to this, they were contacting her every day, updating her on the investigation and made it seem very legitimate to her. And you can see here, this is the narrative that she provided us about what they had done. And when nothing was returned to her account and she could no longer contact them, she realized that it was probably a scam. And she did report it, but by the time she reported it, because they let this drag on for so long, she's not gonna be able to get her money back. And that's, you can see here, over $838,000 was from her investment account. This is money that she was using for retirement. Because of the lag time before she reported it, she can't get the money back. We did refer it to the FBI, but I don't think they were able to do anything on their end. If something like this does happen to you, where you wire money or send money somewhere, if it's within a certain time frame, a couple of days, maybe a week, the FBI and or Secret Service can help stop that transfer and hopefully get at least part of your money back. But once we get to 30 days, it can't happen. But so I like to highlight this. And this individual, by all accounts, was not like some big wig at a medium to large size corporation. This was just an everyday citizen. And for her, I think she thought to herself, why would I be targeted? Like, I'm not a very wealthy person. This is all money in her investment account for retirement. But you can see here that we can all be targeted, and we really have to be vigilant and really maintain awareness of these different tactics that they use. I will check the chat. I think we'll probably answer most of the questions afterwards. So exploiting public interest. And I'm going to highlight, I was talking to the kernel and just highlighting some of the recent incidents that have happened. So when we have something that's happening in the public domain, that there's public interest, COVID-19, of course, the election, stimulus, the vaccine development, unemployment benefits, we start to see that these topics are being used in a lot of social engineering scams. So as part of the lure to get individuals to read that email, click on links, and open attachments. And the last two disaster relief and charity scams I wanted to highlight here, just due to what we've been seeing in the past, several weeks, I guess at this point, or a couple of weeks. After storms and during crises, watch out for scams. So with Hurricane Ida, with the refugee crisis with Afghanistan, you're going to see that more phishing emails we will see on our end, that more of them have that'll be in the subject line of emails. They'll be using that in order to get people to take an action that they desire. Charity scams are very prevalent, and they always pop up around this time when there's, a natural disaster or some other crisis. This website, CharityWatch.org, is very good. It has ratings for different charities. It also has dedicated pages in which they suggest charities based on the criteria that they have. So if you were like, I really want to send money down to the individuals affected by Hurricane Ida, you could go to something like CharityWatch.org. They might have a whole page. I checked for the Afghanistan refugee crisis, but I did not check for Ida. But they had a dedicated page, and they wrote, these are the charities I would recommend based on the percentage that goes to the individuals directly, percentage that goes to that charity's their volunteers, that sort of thing. So this is a good place to go to make sure that if you're being solicited for donations somewhere, that is a legitimate organization and it's going to go where you want your money to go. Always verify information in social media posts. This is obviously not just for something like disaster scams, but also just in general. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and just to make sure that what you're reading is true. Also verify phone numbers for charities, and this goes for any phone calls that you get, because phishing, voice-based phishing, is very prevalent too. You can spoof numbers for which you use to call somebody, and you can see that from all the robocalls that we get. They can make it seem like it's coming from the actual phone number of a charity or an organization. It could look like it's coming from the FBI field office, their phone number, because they've spoofed that number. So making sure that if you get a call and you're really not sure if it's legitimate, you say, okay, I'll call you back, and then look up the number, call the number directly to see if it's actually legitimate. And this goes, across the board. Email spoofing, I did want to highlight this. Let me check the time. There's a couple of slides here. Email spoofing is making emails seem like it's coming from a legitimate organization or entity. It is very, very common. This is an example of just a malicious email. A lot of the time, what they want you to do is click on a link or open an attachment. A lot of the times you'll see it's a Word document or something that looks like a Word document. You open it up and they'll ask you to enable content or enable macros. And you can see here there's a security warning saying macros have been disabled. But it's very easy to ignore all of that warning and just say enable content. But when you enable content on that document, that's oftentimes how malware gets onto the device. That's what they need the user to do to launch that malware on that system. So really never enable content or enable macros. Macros are used legitimately in some Excel files because they can automate processes when you open a file. In Word, I don't know that I know of any example where it's used legitimately. So if you see it, just don't do it. But back to the spoofing, you can see here that somebody is spoofing PayPal. The information within those carets, the email address is not legitimate PayPal email address, but the display name PayPal looks legitimate, and then all of the logo is all correct within the body of the email. Display name spoofing in particular is extraordinarily easy to do. So this is my Gmail. If you go into Gmail, you go under accounts and imports, you go under, which one is it? Send mail as. So you can change what email address, what display name rather, it looks like it's coming from. So I changed it to Vending Machines LLC, because a lot of the time we see email spoofing used to impersonate a vendor of an organization saying, oh, this is the invoice for the services and goods that we provided. So change to Vending Machines LLC. I also changed the reply to address. The reply to address is the address for which, when you send an email, if somebody replies to that email, clicks reply, it'll go to either that email that you sent it from or a different one. And in this case, it's badguy@gmail.com. So you can see here, I sent an email to my legitimate NJCCIC email from what I had put in here. And you can, if you remember, I said I only changed the display name. And you can see here in the carrots, they didn't even change anything here. I didn't actually change anything inside the true carrots. What I did was I put Finance Department at vendingmachines.llc.com in the display name next to Vending Machines LLC. So it looks like it's actually coming from what would be the legitimate email address. I made all this up though. And here's the amount due for the services rendered, XYZ, send it to bank account, Bank of America account, whatever. So you can see here that I didn't really change that much. And it's a 5-minute process to make an email look like it's coming from a legitimate entity. I like to highlight that just so you can see how easy that is. And then even if I didn't change and put the Finance Department at vendingmachines.llc.com in there, if you're on your mobile device, you don't even see any of that. All you see is Vending Machines LLC. You see the display name, and that's it. So unless you actually open that that information up to see the whole, to see the corresponding email address, you're not even going to know it's coming. It's spoofed. And then the example down here, you can see when I replied to that, my reply is actually going to badguy@gmail.com, not the other email address. I won't go into this, but if you want to see if an email is coming from a legitimate, the legitimate email address, you can look at email headers. There are many examples online, resources online on how to open up and find email headers. It's actually not that difficult when you know what to look for within those email headers. This is just another example. This is email spoofing. So it made the email look like it was coming from that user's email account, and they claimed that they had compromised their account. Compromised emails. If your email address or if your email account is compromised, a lot of the time what they'll do is change those reply to emails. They'll also set up auto forward rules. So even if you change your password because you realize that your account's been compromised, you're still going to have all of those emails forwarded over to a separate email account, probably one that is owned by that cyber criminal. So you have to make sure that even when you gain access back to those accounts, those auto forward rules, those reply to rules are no longer in place. You have to go back and check those. And you can see here the forwarding address. So best practices, of course, is going to be just maintain the awareness, having a good understanding of the different tactics and techniques that are used by these cyber threat actors will make you exponentially less likely to fall for them. And never give remote access to your device. In those cases for the tech support scams, for example, a lot of the time they do request remote access to the device, and a lot of the time they just grant it if you really feel like you are talking to somebody from Microsoft. Increasing cyber resiliency, making sure that you're segmenting networks. This is true for your home life too. If you have a bunch of like IoT devices, so cameras, your refrigerator, or whatever it is that's connected to the internet now, you might want to keep that on a separate network than your laptops and desktops. You can segment that relatively easily. And it's good best practice, because if one network is compromised, say somebody gains access to your refrigerator, they're not going to gain access to your laptop, which is on a separate network. Enabling multi-factor authentication. If you take anything away from today, enable MFA for all of your accounts. It seriously is one of the best things that we as individuals can do to increase our cyber resiliency. Keeping hardware and software updated, of course. Employing security technologies. So if you're using any kind of technology to make your network more resilient, increase or decrease your risk. Make sure you're managing those properly. Closing unnecessary connections. So if you at your home network don't need something like RDP enabled, then close that connection, and because then that won't be an attack vector. And then again, maintain that education. These are NJCCIC resources. So because we're part of NJOHS&P, we do not, we're at no cost. Our services are at no cost. Most of our information is available on our website. We are very public facing. We have a lot of resources under the Learn tab in particular, instructional guides, mitigation guides for something like ransomware, for example, cyber safety tips, and you can find this all in cyber.nj.gov, and I'll have the website up momentarily. If you wanted to schedule a presentation, you can do that right from our website as well. So this is our ransomware threat profile. If you're confused after I was going over ransomware, and you're like, I don't really even know what ransomware is. Number one, I can answer that question now, but if you want to go back, you can go to our website and it'll tell you what ransomware is, how it works, and then again, that mitigation strategies guide. This is an example of our weekly bulletin. This is from a couple of weeks ago. We highlighted the unemployment insurance fraud scams and increases in those attempts. We've seen a hell of a lot of that. Probably some of you have been impacted by it. A lot of these claims are being filed fraudulently. And you can see here too, if you have a cybersecurity incident you want to report to us, you can also do that from the website, cyber.nj.gov/report. We cannot physically at this point in most cases go out and help with remediation of a cyber incident. However, we can advise and consult with you over the phone about or over email about what steps that we recommend you take depending on what the cybersecurity incident is. If you haven't fallen victim, but you've received phishing emails, something like that, still report that to us. It's important for us to know what the trends are and what's new techniques so that we can communicate that out to our members. So we can continue that education piece of making people aware. If you want to connect with us, cyber.nj.gov, again, really everything is up on that website. And you can follow us on social media if you want to email us, njkic@cyber.nj.gov, and then you can also call us. I can answer any questions if you have any, but thank you for having me this afternoon.
Great. Thank you very much.